All right, people, welcome back. This is part one of session two of my Brilliant Club catch-up course. If you are not one of my Brilliant Club students, we're moving things on. Last session, the first session in two parts, we looked at kind of the early stage of the war and put a bit of focus onto the 1916 actions. This session, we're going to look back a little bit in terms of kind of some of the problem-solving approach that the British Army, at least, put into fixing some of the problems that became apparent on the Somme, mainly, and what they were going to try and fix for 1917. And we're going to look at 1917 itself as well, give you a little overview of the actions there. So let's get this underway. Armageddon, the offensives of 1917. I mean, yeah, maybe a slightly dramatic look, but the destructive power in 1917 really was something else. Our plan, yeah, like I say, a little bit of a recap session from last time. 1917 actions, did things go any better? Yes and no. Position at the strength at the start of the year, did it change in the course of the year? A little bit on moustaches, potentially. Very important. And for the brilliant clubbers among you, then there was some homework to consider as well. A little bit of battle planning, which we'll fire at the end. Now, I put this slide up in the last session in a kind of what went wrong sense, and maybe did it quickly, so we can give this a little bit more time. And yeah, when we talk about the Battle of the Somme and what went wrong, particularly on the first day, the artillery bombardment comes in for a lot of criticism in the things that it did not do. And what was the function of that artillery bombardment? Destroy the barbed wire, main job. Destroy defenses, yeah. Kill Germans, absolutely. Didn't do nearly enough of any of those things, and there's a few reasons for it. I mean, firstly, I mean, just as a quick one, we ballpark about a third of shells didn't actually explode. So you fire these things out, nothing. And that's about a third of your destructive power gone. And when you've already set ambitious tasks for the artillery, as Haig had done, really that's just too much. There's also the whole aspect of just being too spread out, just too big an area to try and beat up before the infantry attacks. And if you remember from the last session, we talked about when they shrunk the frontage down for the attack on Bazentan Ridge, that bombardment was much more intense, and so yeah, and that attack worked as it happened. So there's a few other things as well. One of the problems they had was with some of their fusing in their shells. Now, this is really techy, and hopefully it's going to be understandable when we kind of get to it. They had a problem with their fusing, and I'm far from an expert on fuses, but my essential understanding is pre-war they'd had problems with shells exploding in the gun barrels when they fired the gun. The fuse on the shell, this high explosive shell, would initiate on the gun firing instead of when it hits something. All right, it initiates, boom, blows the gun up, kills the crew, disaster. And to prevent that from happening, what engineers did was work an ever so slight delay into the fuse of the gun, of the shell itself. So boom, if they fire it and the fuse initiates, you've got that slight delay. So while the shell's traveling, it travels out of the gun, then it blows up, bang, explodes outside the gun, doesn't blow up the gun itself, doesn't kill the crew. And although the shell hasn't worked, it's malfunctioned, the damage is less. Okay. Now, trouble is, you take that into the First World War, and one of the jobs is to destroy the barbed wire. Okay, you fire these shells with a slight delay, and if they haven't gone wrong, okay, they're whirling off through the air with that delay, and then they hit the ground with barbed wire around them, and they sink into the ground a little bit because, you know, they've got that slight delay, and then poof, and that destructive energy, that explosion, goes into moving earth around rather than actually destroying the barbed wire. Okay, and so what they needed was an instantaneous fuse that was reliable enough to not go off in the gun. All right, it's quite a long-winded explanation. Hopefully it was comprehensible. They didn't have it in 1916, but they needed it, and they realized that they needed it. Because at the moment, all their artillery, I mean, it's firing off, it's sort of exploding in the barbed wire, but all it's doing is kind of cratering the ground up, making it more difficult to cross for the infantry because it's all holes and stuff, and not actually breaking the barbed wire. So you've got a double whammy of uselessness, really, with those shells. So that instantaneous fuse would be arriving in early 1917. So that's one thing. And a lot of this is not stuff that the soldiers themselves can fix. It's not stuff that the generals can fix. They can identify a problem, but that's up to industry at home to fix the quality of the shells and give them a reliable fuse that will do the job. They'll be working on that. Command and communication. Okay, problem. How do you communicate with your men once they have gone over the top and attacked? Well, it's very, very difficult to. They might be able to send you messages and using things like this Webley flare pistol. You know, load a flare into that, fire it up, what, click, boink. And that fires a coloured flare. Okay, they had some of these during the Somme offensive at various stages. They get into some muddles occasionally when the Germans fire flares that mean different things to what the British do. So, for example, a white flare. Poof, that's the British signal for our attack has been successful. We need reinforcements. Can you please send up the second or third wave? All right, that's a white flare. Trouble is, the Germans in that area are also using a white flare to say, we are under attack. We require a defensive bombardment on no man's land, please. Okay. Potentially very, very serious consequences for the second or third British wave there as a German artillery bombardment drops on them. So a little bit more sophistication with things like this. There were various methods of communication on the battlefield, none of them ideal, it has to be said. Telephone wires could be run around. These would often break. Runners themselves, actual like messengers, could get shot, could, you know, get lost, not be able to deliver their message for whatever reason. They did have carrier pigeons as well, fixing messages to them. It's not particularly fun job carrying a pigeon around on your back into action, but these could work provided the bird didn't get shot themselves or, you know, too muddy or whatever. Anyway, things, a bit more sophistication there in communication needed, or just soldiers who know their job well enough to not need specific instruction, and also holding back a reserve. So if a commander sees a problem, you know, if they've sent all their soldiers over in the first wave, then there's not very much they can do. Whereas if they've held back a reserve, maybe sent a portion of their force forward, you know, they can see they've been held up. All right, we can send reserves to try and fix the problems. Okay, so there's command and communication things that they could improve on there. Supply to attacking troops and reinforcements. Now, these are really crucial for defeating counterattacks. Okay, now one of the things that becomes apparent for the British on the Somme is that there are there's three things in life you can be sure of: death, taxes, and German counterattack. They're going to come for you at some point, and certain commanders, rather than seeing that as, you know, something to fear, actually saw that as an opportunity to inflict some casualties on the enemy. And so to do that, you'd need to have some energy, you need to have some ammunition, so you couldn't be exhausted from having carried everything that you need for a couple of days on you. If you're going forward in an assaulting wave, you need to carry what you need for that attack and nothing else. So you're relatively light, you can fight, but then you need other people to supply you. And so carrying parties, the importance of these guys becomes very important later on. And we'll, you know, in kind of later sessions, we'll talk about sort of specific kind of roles, but things like ammunition would need to be brought up, water would need to be brought up, barbed wire would need to be brought up to help you wire up the trenches that you captured, so that when the Germans counterattack, they meet a load of fresh wire in front of them. All right. Reinforcements, similarly, having fresh troops ready to come up and help with the counterattack, very, very valuable indeed. Assault formation, right. Simplifying this horrendously, what you may have ended up with in the early stages of the Somme campaign in certain units is essentially your platoon is, if you remember, about 50 men-ish, led by a lieutenant who may have done something in the early stages of the war, like wave a stick and say, right, come on, chaps, follow me. And unfortunately, if he then gets hit or something happens to him, you are fairly leaderless in that sense. And the soldiers who were following the lieutenant then think, oh, I don't want to get shot, they'll take cover. If they're simply advancing in lines, they're very prone to being caught by enfilade fire as well. The Germans, with their machine guns, they don't tend to just sort of fire directly in front of them. They'll tend to fire at an angle and sweep down a line, and that way they can do a lot more damage. In fact, so, you know, it's often not the machine gun that's in front of you firing that causes the casualties in your unit. It could be firing some distance away off to the side. So these formations need a look at, and also they needed something a little bit more sophisticated than simply like an enemy machine gun starts firing and your lieutenant stands up and says, right, chaps, follow me. No, it needs to be a bit better than that. And that came in the course of the Somme offensive and got firmed up into training methods for the British over the winter of 1916-17. And essentially, if I kind of summarize it briefly into what it kind of became, initially, they found that these things called Lewis guns were very, very useful. Okay, and a Lewis gun is essentially a light machine gun. It's not very light necessarily, but it, you know, compared to the big heavy machine guns it was, had a drum of ammunition on top, didn't need a water tank or anything like that to come with it, didn't need a massive mount on either, and so could be fairly happily crewed by, you know, 6 men carrying ammunition for it as well. You probably need a few more to make a heavy machine gun work. If they could get enough of these for 1 per platoon, that would be very, very useful, because, you know, kind of tied in with the command and communication thing. How many men do you think you could command while the world's exploding around you, while there's machine gun bullets hammering around all over the place? Well, they worked out that a platoon is about as big a formation as it is possible to command. If that's the case, with communication so difficult, platoons have to be able to solve their own problems, okay? They have to be able to fight as a contained unit and overcome difficulty, all right? So with all this bear in mind, I know I'm going to try and pull a load of different threads, okay? We've got useful light machine guns. We also have things like rifle grenades, okay? So a hand grenade, in its simplest, is that. It's a Mills bomb. You know, it looks like a grenade. It's got a ring that you pull, which then releases a lever, which sets a timed fuse. Fairly reliable. Okay, good. So we've got plenty of these. We've got ones that can be fired with a rifle as well. And we do have our rifles themselves. All action Lee Enfield. Good. A decent rifle, as long as, you know, men are trained in, you know, how to shoot with it and not just carry it and try and use it as a pointy, stabby, beaty over the head kind of weapon. All right. We've got our rifles. We've got our hand grenades. We've got a Lewis gun and what did I say? Rifle grenades as well. Hand grenades, rifle grenades. Okay. Now, if we separate each section in a platoon, all right, 4 sections, 4 types of weapon, all right, and we give each of those sections a weapon and a set role, it means that, right, we've got 1 section with the Lewis gun, 1 section with the rifle grenades, 1 section keeping their rifles with the bayonets, and 1 section with the hand grenades. It means that when your platoon meets an enemy machine gun, rather than right, chaps, follow me, it's, all right, lieutenant gets his section commanders together, gets the sergeant, his platoon sergeant with them and says, right, okay, Lewis gunners, you're going to provide covering fire over here. Rifle grenadiers, hit that machine gun. I want to shut it up. All right. And sergeant, you're going to take the bombers and the bayonet men in, and you're going to knock out the crew. All right. This kind of fighting is almost recognizable, I'd say, to modern soldiers, really, but it comes through in the Somme fighting and the training thereafter. Okay. So that kind of covers assault formation. It covers elements of command and communication as well. As far as maintaining secrecy goes, I'm going to sum this up pretty quickly. Don't shoot at the Germans for a week beforehand if you don't want them to know that you're going to attack them. All right. And if you're going to do something sneaky, do it sneakily, do it at night, something like that. Okay. Don't just hope that things are going to work. And fighting quality of the troops all comes with experience and training. Okay. Now, 1917 actions on the Western Front. In the early part of the year, you have this German withdrawal to the Siegfriedstellung. So what I described in the previous video, this takes place, gets okayed in January and actually takes place in a few different stages from February through, and the major withdrawal takes place in March. Okay, March the 17th is the day when the British realise, hang on a minute, the Germans are gone from the line in front of them. So then they start this pursuit to the Hindenburg line, and there's some action in the outpost villages, and then a few smaller scale attacks on the Hindenburg line, but it's all gearing up for Nivelle's offensive. And I mentioned him in our last session as well. Robert Nivelle was the man who had been promoted to the head of the French armies off the basis that he reckoned he could win the war in 1917 using techniques that he'd employed around Verdun the previous year. And essentially the plan was this. We're going to attack in a number of different points using a lot of artillery. The first stage would be an attack by the British army in the area where the Siegfried line meets the Wotan line. Okay, we're going to threaten both of those around Arras. And the hope there was that a strong British attack would bring lots of German reserves into that area. They'd have to thin out their line elsewhere, and the French would be able to launch 3 attacks, bang, 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 which would break the line somewhere. Okay, that was the crux of Nivelle's plan, his promise, and he promised to break through in 48 hours, or he'd call off the offensive. That was his plan. Now, what did the British make of this plan? Well, it depends who you ask, really. Haig, who had been promoted to Field Marshal by early 1917, probably didn't hate the idea. I think much gets made of the kind of disagreements made by the British and the French, and the movements of the British Prime Minister at this time, the new British Prime Minister, who it seems wanted to put Haig under Nivelle's command because he trusted Nivelle more than Haig, which didn't go very down all that well with Haig or sections of the British press. I don't think Haig had that much of a problem with Nivelle's plan, to be honest. Really, Haig wanted to be attacking further north in the kind of Flanders area for a few reasons. He saw maybe the best chance of a breakthrough possibly there, but certainly the chance to stop the supply to the German submarine ports on the Belgian coast there, where they were sending the submarines out, which were attacking British shipping. There's potentially quite a big win there. Now, if he was going to attack in Flanders, he would want another attack somewhere else first anyway. I'm sure he would have been prepared to launch an attack with his own soldiers somewhere else to draw German reserves away. And if he could have engineered some strong French attacks to help with that process as well, perfect. And so actually Nivelle's plan is not a hateful thing for Haig at all, provided he can transfer the offensive action to Flanders soon anyway, which was his plan. I've skipped ahead a little bit there to the Messines Ridge offensive. The long and the short with the Nivelle offensive was that it didn't work. The British attack at Arras went well initially, made some pretty big gains, and definitely drew German reserves in. So in that sense, it fulfilled its objectives. But the French attacks, when they went off, didn't break through. Part of the problem was this withdrawal that the Germans had made. They pulled out of part of the battlefield that Nivelle had planned to attack. They'd also freed up a lot of reserves in making this movement so that they could contain the French breakthrough. And the French didn't do nothing with their attacks. They didn't just fail completely out of hand, but they didn't break through in that 48 hours that Nivelle had promised. After, this had gone on a few days longer than planned, elements of the French army just had really had enough. And it's not, what we talk about, mutinies is kind of what they're called, the mutinies in the French army in May 1917. And it's a strong word, mutiny, for what happened. Essentially, large chunks of the French army refused to go on the offensive. Now, that's not the same as shooting their commanders and going home. Because they still didn't want to lose the war. Actually, the French army was still conscious of the fact that they had been invaded, and a big chunk of France was still under enemy occupation, and they weren't happy with that. But what they weren't going to do was just keep throwing themselves headlong into assaults, as they had done in 1914, in 1915, in 1916, and now in 1917. It just seemed like they were doing exactly the same thing again, not getting anywhere. And so, yes, large chunks of the French army refused to attack, which is a problem. A problem for the French, a problem for the British as well, because they'd essentially be on their own in terms of large-scale offensives for the remainder of the year. And they wanted to keep those large-scale offensives going because they did genuinely see an opportunity to try and break the German army. Now, with the French stopping the attack, it's left up to the British. They initially tried to restart the Arras campaign to hold the Germans in that area, and this turned into awful fighting, very kind of poorly planned attacks. What we end up with the Battle of Arras is the most lethal battle for the British Army in terms of rate of death per day. The Battle of Arras is a shorter campaign, but they lose men at the rate of over 4,000 a day becoming casualties, whereas the Somme, it was like 2,900. So it's far worse than the Somme in that sense. And really, they don't achieve very much more, and they don't really hold that many Germans in that area either. So you can't claim that was a success, unfortunately. But the following month, they're transferring everything further north, and the first stage of the Flanders offensive is an attack on the Messines Ridge, which is a ridge line which they thought they needed to capture in order to help the main advance a little bit further north. And this had been planned since 1915, essentially, and through 1916 they'd been working on these tunnels in the hope that they'd get to attack in 1916, say if the Somme campaign had been a bit more successful, they would have gone at Messines Ridge earlier. But no, now's their time. And these tunnels underneath, charged with explosive underneath the German lines, they detonated 19 of these mines in sequence. Blam, 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 down the line. And, well, there's now a collection of large round ponds in that part of Belgium. And the attack was successful, as it happens. It's coupled with an almighty artillery barrage, really, and a strong infantry assault with a few tanks in support too. And Messines Ridge was captured. After that, takes a good few weeks to get the guns out of their Messines Ridge positions and into their spots for the next stage of the campaign, the Third Battle of Ypres. Which is infamous, I want to say. It's notorious, and it's what people think of when they think of the First World War. The Third Battle of Ypres is also known as the Passchendaele campaign, and it is what people think of when they think of the First World War, usually, because there was heavy rain through chunks of the battle. A lot of destructive artillery firepower turned the ground into a bog, and the British Army essentially got stuck. Now, the reason people focus on this is the casualties. I mean, the British Army advanced, what, 6-7 miles or so in that end of July through to mid-November spell. It cost about 245,000 British casualties, so not as many as the Somme, but when you see the conditions and you see what men were trying to work through, it just says, what on earth were they doing trying to get through that? Well, yeah, that takes some defending, actually, and I'm not going to try at the moment because I want to move on to the next one. While that was going on, it was really frustrating for the British Army because they had genuinely felt like there was a chance of a breakthrough to go. And there'd been a few flashes of brilliance shown by tanks where they'd done something really, really useful. Arras, you got maybe one or two little stories there. Through the Third Ypres campaign, you've got kind of, I guess, one episode where things have really worked and tanks have gone behind a line of bunkers and unpicked a German defensive position. And so there was kind of still hope. Anyway, Haig had ordered hundreds of them. Trouble is, he couldn't use them in Flanders because there was so much mud. So he had to bring the offensive action down. And so late November, you have the Battle of Cambrai, where you got another attack. It's in the area of the Wotan-Siegfried lines again. It's more a Siegfried line assault, Cambrai. And you've got over 300 tanks. That's impressive from an industrial point of view, and to get them all in one place together is quite something. But it's more than just that, Cambrai. You've also got something innovative with the artillery. Here's the problem with the artillery, okay? You usually miss, okay, quite simply. Your guns get themselves into position, and their position would be about, I don't know, 2, maybe 3 miles behind your own lines, and they're going to be firing over the heads of your soldiers, which means they can't actually see what they're shooting at, and they usually miss, okay? Unless you've got a guy with a pair of binoculars in a frontline trench watching where the shells land, okay? So, right, we're going to register this battery, register it, make sure it's going to hit its target. So, right, fire a shell, boff. No, you missed to the left, okay? Come right a bit, okay, boff. No, that's too far right. You're going to have to come back to the left a little bit. Boof, boof. Yeah, okay, that's the right line, but you've overshot. You need to bring it back a little bit. Boof. Oh no, that's too short. No, you need to push it back a little bit further than that. Boof. All right, that's it. That's it. You hit your target. Let's have everything firing along those lines. Okay, all right, but what are the Germans doing when you're doing that? Right, the Germans sat in a trench or in a bunker or on a gun battery or something like that, and he said, a shell comes over, dump, and lands to his left, dump, lands to his right, dump, dump, lands behind him, dump, dump, lands in front of him, and he's thinking, I know what's going on here. Right, let's get the guns out of the way. Let's move it. So when that artillery bombardment is ranged in, registered and accurate, everyone's either undercover or they've moved the important stuff, or they've moved reserves in behind because they've seen this registration taking place and everyone's prepared for it. Okay, now by this stage in 1917, late 1917, November time, what the British gunners had got the hang of is, right, we've got accurate maps of this area now, so we can sort of register the levels of the ground, and we've got decent mathematicians who can, using complex trigonometry and whatnot, I don't understand, can calculate the trajectory and that, and we've got the wind speed and humidity and all these other kind of meteorological conditions, and we weigh all that up and put it together and make our calculations, and so boff, pretty close to on target, close enough. Anyway, all right, we've looked at the wear of the guns and all this sort of stuff. So we move all these guns into position quietly, secretly, without any pre-registration to give the game away. Blam, drop it. And that dropped a very heavy, accurate artillery bombardment on the German positions at Cambrai. Now, that doesn't take care of the barbed wire. Okay, and that was the reason these preliminary bombardments have been going on, for wire cutting purposes. But hang on, we've got the tanks, okay, and the tanks are there to crush the wire. So we don't need a big preliminary bombardment, and it was stunning, and it was a surprise, and it was good. And so there's a big advance made at Cambrai. However, the thing that the British didn't think the Germans had in them at that stage, because of all the mauling in the previous actions up in Flanders, and, you know, from the French and all this other stuff in the course of 1917, the Germans launched a big, strong counterattack and captured back the ground that the British had gained. And not only that, they actually captured quite a few of the tanks that the British had used as well. So Germans would then have tanks of their own later on. That's a picture of a British tank, the German cross on it. You know, Germans were designing their own tanks as well on top of that too. Okay, so that's about the Cambrai in a nutshell. It's a really, really interesting case study and doesn't probably get enough attention, but hey ho. Anyway, situation at the end of 1917. Despite a huge amount of effort from the British, there was still no breakthrough in the West. I mean, the kitchen sink had been fully deployed, but no joy. The Americans did join the war. Now, I know we mentioned those chaps. They had joined the war after the episode with the Zimmerman telegram, and, you know, that's the Mexican thing, and the unrestricted submarine warfare. And many would arrive, but you kind of got to think about the Americans in 1917 or late 1917 in kind of the same way that we think about the British in maybe like early 1915. There's not very many of them, and they're not very effective. Okay, they're still learning their trade, and they're still new to the battlefield, and yeah, so they're not a scary prospect for the Germans just yet. Russia is in revolution. They had two revolutions in 1917. The October one is the big problematic one for the Allies because it takes Russia out of the war, essentially. Now, it's not quite as simple as they're just closing down the Eastern Front, but Germany would be able to bring back a lot of soldiers that had been fighting the Russians to come and fight the British and French. And that's very, very bad news, actually, for the British and French. The bad news continues with reports from Italy. Now, the Germans cooperated with the Austro-Hungarians in October, again, 1917, to launch an attack around the Italian-Slovenian border, really, nowadays, a place called Caporetto, Kobarid, if you're in Slovenia. Now, the word Caporetto is, I'm informed, still in the Italian language as like a, you know, imagine your football team loses 10-0 and your star striker and captain both get sent off, and, you know, someone else gets injured, and it's just an absolute, complete and utter disaster. They'd say this is Caporetto. Okay, essentially they had one of their field armies destroyed, Second Army. About 300,000 Italian soldiers put their hands in the air at Caporetto. And so to stop the Italian army falling apart altogether, what the British and French decide to do is send soldiers round. So just at the time the Germans are getting stronger, the British and the French are going to weaken themselves to strengthen the Italian army, okay, and keep their allies in the war, which is, again, bad news for Britain and France. The French were able to make some you know, small or medium-sized offensives later in 1917. They needed a bit of work put into their morale, and making sure the soldiers knew that generals had their best interests at heart. Essentially, it wasn't just enough to say, you are Frenchmen, you are, you know, subordinate to us, and you will charge when we tell you. No, they had to look after them a bit, which is just good sense, really. But yeah, they needed to do it. The British were not in trouble as such, as far as manpower was, but they'd lost a lot in 1917 through, you know, Arras and Third Ypres, on top of their Somme losses, and were restructuring as well in a kind of they're working out that they need many more kind of support troops to bring stuff forward and make sure things are you know, are moving smoothly, than they actually needed kind of frontline troops. So they're kind of readjusting and bringing more troops in a kind of support role, but it means that they're short on the front lines, quite simply. And so they decide to maintain the same number of divisions that they have on the Western Front, which was, you know, over 50 by this stage, over 50 divisions on the Western Front. they would need to strip some manpower, strip some infantry manpower out of their divisions. Okay, so that's what they did. That's what they did. And each brigade dropped down to 3 battalions. So that's 9 infantry battalions in a division now, as opposed to 12. You're losing a quarter of your infantry. That's potentially a blow, but they got more kind of light machine guns. They're making up the firepower in other ways. Anyway, big plan, nutshell plan was to stand on the defensive. In 1918, not go on the offensive at all, wait for the Americans to get stronger, and then maybe have a pop in 1919. And when you consider all of that, it is kind of amazing, really, that Britain and France ended up on the winning side in 1918. But hey ho. The homework plan for my brilliant clubbers is this. Now, if you get your booklets, hopefully you've got a booklet. If you're doing my course, you'll find these pages attached to kind of session 2, and the main object for this is to get you thinking about what it takes to plan an attack in the First World War, and it's far more than we will climb out of our trenches and we will charge. Okay, there's lots of things to consider. What time of day you're going to do it? What time do you want your men in positions? What are they going to take with them? Are you going to have different kind of units, moving at different, objectives, or with different weapons, something like that? How is your flank protection going to look after itself? Are you going to assign separate units to that? And you've got sort of dispositions in your booklet. You've got the sort of number of men that you've got to work with there. What is your artillery going to shoot at? Are they going to have different targets at different times? Unit formations. How are you going to break your barbed wire? You got potential use of some Bangalore torpedoes there, which might come in handy. How are you going to make sure you defeat that counterattack when it comes? And is there anything else? And just by way of a hint, it was flipping cold. Then 4th of March 1917, dropping below freezing most of the day, and dropping below kind of -8, -10 at night time. So very, very cold. Moustaches, ratemymoustache.com. A little bit of levity at the end of the session. Goes quite well in the classroom. This marks out of 10. Douglas Haig usually rates a sort of 6 or 7. Out of 10 for that moustache. Obviously Commander-in-Chief of British Armies from 1915 to 1918. This is Joseph Joffre, the French Army's Chief of Staff. Usually ranks in the sort of 8-9 category. It's a solid moustache. The man in the middle there is Herbert Plumer, or Plummer. And he was commander of British Second Army. So it was his army that launched the Messines Ridge offensive, and then he took over the 3rd Ypres offensive after the chap initially in command was given the heave-ho. Well liked, Plumer. I don't necessarily think he was the greatest general of the war, but very thorough in his planning and well liked. 4th along as Paul von Hindenburg. He would go on and become president of the Republic of Germany after the war, but for this stage he was effectively in charge of the German army. And that's quite a moustache, but that divides people actually. Some people don't like that moustache. Sometimes you get like a 1 or a 2 at some sort of a 9 or 10, 11 out of 10. Would recommend. And then on at the end there is Luigi Cadorna, who was in charge of the Italian armies, from the start of the war through to Caporetto, when he was removed. And generally speaking, all the kind of bad reputation stuff that you think about with First World War British generals, and how they were very harsh on their own men and not particularly creative, and that kind of applies to him. Actually, Luigi Cadorna, not seen as the sharpest sandwich in the picnic, but hey ho. Right, that's enough. Talk for long enough. That's the session. Hope it was useful. If you're not one of my brilliant clubbers, Hope you enjoyed the moustaches, and see you next time when we crack on into 1918. Ciao for now.